This is the Ideas Podcast, the show where instructional designers discuss ideas over a nice cup of tea. Warning, other beverages may be consumed. In this episode, I catch up with David Kofoed Wind, CEO at EdTech, about advancements in the EdTech world and how AI may or may not shape the future of learning and development. Welcome to another episode of the Ideas Podcast. Today, David Kofoed Wind is with me to talk about, as always, all things L&D, but really specifically about the world of EdTech, which is really exciting for me. It's a field that I tend to dance around the periphery of. So today I can dive in and hopefully learn some more about it. And, you know, with everything going on in the world right now, what a topic and time to discuss it. As always, David, over to you to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Yeah, so as you said, I'm David. I am 31 years old. I live in Copenhagen in Denmark. I have a girlfriend and a kid and another kid coming. So that's my personal life. Then what I do day to day is that I run an EdTech company called EdTech. And to explain how I got there, I guess it's a good idea to go back to the beginning. So I, like many programmers these days, I learned to code when I was a little kid. My dad had a computer. I started playing around with it. I wanted to make games. So I started to learn to code myself, went to university eventually and decided to study computer science and math. And then after that, I continued as a PhD student. I was supposed to do machine learning algorithms and those kind of things in my PhD. But pretty quickly after I started my PhD, I got the opportunity to teach my own course. And during my own studies, I've been a teaching assistant, I think 12 or 15 times. Like almost every semester, I was TAing multiple courses at the uni. So I really like teaching, but I never really gotten the chance to do my own thing. So when I got this opportunity, I said, cool, I'll make a course, and I'll make a course that is actually useful for people. People know too much theory in this university. We should do some practical stuff. And I cooked up this course and I called it, I think, Computational Tools with Big Data. And I had this imagination of this very active learning course where you would do things every week and hand in homework. But I think because of the words big data, this became a very popular course to enroll in. I think everybody who came from abroad to study with us, they went to the course database, searched for big data, and found my course first. So instead of the expected 30 students, I got 150 enrollments.
Wow.
And that was all good, right? But then you realize that 150 students, weekly homework, that's completely bonkers. So I had like 40 hours of grading every week if I had to run the course that way.
That's a nice full-time job for you there then.
Yeah, and what a job, right? Everybody loves grading.
Oh, yes.
And I think my 40 hours would be like, you spend 5 minutes per paper, you just give it a grade, and then you move on, right? So everybody's happy, me and the students. So I sat down, I thought, okay, what could I do about this that would make everybody happy instead? And I remembered that I think a year earlier or 6 months earlier, I had taken a course online that had a mild version of peer review implemented in it. And I thought that was kind of cool, that I could kind of leverage the student body to help me assess the papers and give feedback. I couldn't use that software, and I had some ideas for how to improve it based on some mathematics I'd done earlier in my studies. So I thought, okay, I can just build this thing myself. It doesn't take any time to build software, right? So I just sat down, I started coding it, and my supervisor found out about it. So he said, oh, this is a great idea, David. We should totally build this and you should sell it to the department. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why would my department buy software from me? But he was like, that's fine. We can let's go and sell it to the department head. So he dragged me up to the department head. I explained what I was doing. He asked what it cost. I gave him a price and he said, okay, let's do it. But you can only get one TA then instead of 4. And I said, okay, I guess if it works, that I don't need all those TAs, right? I can just do this myself and let the students grade each other. So somehow I sold a license to my own software, and then I had a few months to develop it. And I think I panicked a little bit. So I called up my old high school friend who's also a programmer and said, I've made a huge mistake. I've sold a product I don't have. I have 2 months to build it. Will you be my one teaching assistant? And then just help me build this thing instead of being a TA, and then I'll teach the course myself. Um, and he said, okay. And he joined me. He's my co-founder now. And we started building this product that we called PeerGrade, which was a peer-to-peer assessment product for the course I was teaching. So that's how I got started in this whole thing. It was a total random coincidence. It wasn't supposed to be a business. I just suddenly had to send an invoice because I sold a license, and that's kind of how I got into EdTech. Then there's much more to the story of, if you remember, earlier I said in our conversation that the product I was building is called EduFlow, and I just told you about a product called PeerGrade, and that's obviously not the same thing. But that's kind of the starting point of the whole thing.
Well, that's certainly one way to kickstart a career. That's always a brave move to sell something you don't have yet.
It's a good idea, right? I think
absolutely.
That's the best validation you can get, is just somebody bought it already, so you better build it.
Well, clearly the idea was strong enough that even without the finished product, that speaks volumes of it. And out of interest, there, I mean, how did it go beyond that point? Did it land well? Did it do everything you hoped it would do?
Well, not exactly, right? So I built it, and when I say I built it, we had a version that didn't work at all on day one, but you could sign in. You could sign into the product. There was nothing to do inside the product, because we knew that from day one of the course, there would still be a week and a half before the first submissions had to go in. So we had a week and a half to build that. And then after that, we had a week more before the first peer reviews had to be done because of deadlines. So we could kind of build the plane as we were flying, right? And it was a bit of a shit show, but it ended up okay. And the good thing was that every week I would go to the lecture hall. I would have my 150 students sit there and complain about it. And I could just write down all their complaints. They would line up in exercise hours and just tell us all the bugs that we had, and we could fix them right there. So it's very effective in terms of getting feedback. And then besides that, right, I remember the first day of the course, I come in, I open with my opening lecture, and I have a set of slides about peer review. And I say, well, you're going to be peer reviewing each other's work, and your whole grade is going to depend on this. And they start raising their hand, and they're like, no, thank you. we do not want this. This seems insane, and we don't trust each other. And we're like, okay, change plans. What do we do now? And kind of on the spot, we came up with this idea that we said, like, what if inside the product, every time you get some feedback, you can click a big red button, and then I'll grade that part instead. So if you don't like anything, you can just click the button and I'll grade it. And they're like, okay, I guess that's fair. It's kind of like a safety valve for the system.
Yeah.
So we built this. We called it flagging the feedback. And eventually, I think we had to grade 10% of the work in the course, but 4 hours a week is different than 40 hours a week. And the students actually ended up being pretty happy with the experience, and I saved 36 hours a week on grading.
Wow, and I'm guessing the experience of peer reviewing content puts them in fantastic stead for whether that's further education or going into the workplace in respective careers. It's going to give them a much more contextualized learning experience rather than just focusing on their own work.
Yeah, and I think I knew nothing about this when I did this, right? I was a naive mathematician who was just like, ooh, I can save some time here. And then later I started reading all the papers about learning technology and like feedback and all of this. Now I've read hundreds of papers about it, but back then that was totally not my motivation. But surely there's all this research about like how much you learn from assessing other people's products. And I think for students, the first real insight is that like, ooh, it's actually really nice to see what other people did. Like if there's my problems in the course were semi-open-ended, so you could solve them in different ways. And just seeing like, okay, this is a nice way to solve it, or wow, that's a cool way to write a report. That helped people. And after a week or two, nobody did any of the basic mistakes anymore because they had downloaded a set of reports from earlier that other students did really well that they could kind of go back and reference to.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because peer review is very common whenever I speak to anyone that comes from an academic background. It's very, very common. It's the kind of the bedrock of how this content is produced. Then you step into the corporate world, and the idea of having people grade their own work or share answers is, people are aghast at the very idea, as though somehow the world will crumble if people help each other out. It's a really interesting split.
In software development, it's very common, right? So they call it code review, and any good software company will employ the practice of having people review each other's code. Everything we build now is code reviewed by another developer. And I think it's one of the most learning intensive parts of being a programmer is that you have to read other people's code every day. So that's, some people employ it a good amount, and a lot of people don't employ it enough, I think, in the corporate world, as you say. And I guess maybe people do it indirectly and under the radar by just like talking to each other. It's also, you can do peer assessment very informally often, and that's also very helpful. So I guess what we tried to bring to market was a way to do peer feedback at scale in a very structured way. Because if you just take a class of 150 students and have them swap papers with their neighbor and say like, hey, grade this, it won't be very good, right? They will make all the mistakes and they'll say, what do I have to do? And nothing good will come of it. But by scaffolding the process massively, it becomes a really good experience.
Oh, it sounds really, really fantastic. I wish there had been something like that when I was doing my degrees and papers, rather than, as you say, sort of submitting and waiting with bated breath to get your very formal mark back. So I guess that kind of leads us in quite nicely to your entrance into EdTech, and since then the field it feels like every couple of months there's something else appearing on the horizon that's very exciting and coming into the field. And I guess it'd be interesting to hear from yourself, when you look at the EdTech sort of industry or field, however you want to look at it, what are the things that excite you at the moment? What do you see and think, oh, I can't wait for that?
Yeah, I guess that kind of leads to the other half of my story, right? Which is what happened next. So we started PeerGrade 5 years ago, I think, back in 2015. And after 3 or 4 years of running PeerGrade, we were doing pretty well, right? We got some investments from some famous investors. We had users all around the world. We have all Danish universities as customers and so on. So everything was going pretty well. We weren't as big as we hoped, I think, at that point, and we were starting to see some limitations to what we built. We could see that if we had a university saying, we really like PeerGrade, we'll tell everybody about it, then and in the end, only, let's say, 10% of instructors in a university even does peer review. Doesn't matter if they use PeerGrade or not, they just don't do peer review, most of them. And the people who do, they use it once in a while. You don't do peer review every day, and you shouldn't, because it's just one tool in the toolbox.
Yes.
But that meant that even if we had a successful interaction with the university, the end game was maybe us being used 1% at the time. And that's okay, but it'd be nice if it was more. We felt that we were good at building products, and people really liked what we did. And we had some ambitions about what we could do differently with PeerGrade. And we got so much feedback. We love feedback, right? So we gathered feedback from our users over the years. And I think we ended up with a database of 10,000 comments from our users about what they wanted. And when we looked at all these ideas, it was basically that they liked what we were doing. They just wanted something slightly different because their class was just slightly different than everybody else's class. They wanted a slightly different way to set deadlines. They wanted to change the process a little bit in how it worked. So you don't give peer feedback and then give feedback on the feedback, but you give yourself some feedback and all these kind of like just a slight alteration on the thing we'd built. And we could just see that our technology was getting a bit gray and old, so it was hard to do all these things well. So after 3 or 4 years, we started over. We said, what if we build everything again? Like, what would we do differently? And then we went on this long design trip to kind of think it all over. And we started building a product that now is live and called EduFlow, which is essentially a way to build online learning processes. And that's very vague. But we wanted to build a product where you as an instructor could make a learning experience online that is very structured, includes components like peer feedback and so on. But where you can almost think of it as like a programming language for online courses. You can build exactly the online course you want, but without knowing how to program. So we set about doing this about a year and a half ago, and today that's our new product. It's built in a way that it will replace PeerGrade. We built it so that it's kind of backward compatible, and everything you could do in PeerGrade, you can also do in EduFlow, but you can also do much more. And that's kind of the journey we're on now, and I guess that kind of leads into what's going on right now in EdTech. And I think the development of EdTech, the history of EdTech is kind of interesting. I recently read this book. It's called 25 Years of EdTech, about a guy who goes back and then he just writes a chapter for every year for the last 25 years and say, what was the big thing this year in EdTech? And I didn't know any of this because I hadn't done EdTech for that long. But it was super interesting to see that if you go back 25 years, EdTech starts with online bulletin boards, kind of the early internet. You can talk to each other on a forum. And back then, the internet didn't have the capability of live video streaming. So the only thing you could do was text messaging, right? And that means that when the innovators back then were doing EdTech, they were doing like collaborative online learning experiences, which is super interesting. And then a lot of different things happen. We get learning management systems and so on. And then the internet catches up and people start doing video streaming. And then it's like all the pedagogy kind of evaporates. And then we just do live video streaming. Now we go back to like, let's record lectures and put them online.
Yep.
And let's delete all the forums. Let's forget about all the good social things we had going on. Now the focus is just high quality video performances. And I think what we're seeing now is a renaissance of the old days. We're tired of videos and quizzes. People want more. They want to have social learning experiences online, and they want the learning experiences online that they're used to having offline. And that there's so many paths to go on now in terms of where we take this conversation, but that's kind of what's going on right now, I think, is that people are going back to the basics of saying we want more than videos and quizzes.
Absolutely. I think I mentioned before when we were sort of discussing what we were going to talk about in today's show briefly. You sent me a fantastic phrase in an email about Zoom University. And I couldn't stop laughing for about 5 minutes once I'd read it, mostly because my wife's working from home at the moment, and every half an hour it seems like she's on some kind of video conferencing call. And the number of people I speak to who are going, oh yes, we're going digital for the first time, so we've installed Zoom and we're going to do some video content. And I think it's interesting to hear you say that, as the internet brought up, we almost stopped doing as good a job, which I think is true. I think technology almost was almost used as an excuse to take the burden off. If I just record the video, they've got the information, they can consume it at their pace. It's now their problem.
Yeah.
Almost felt like the approach for many years. So I guess it'd be quite interesting to hear from your perspective, businesses that now perhaps 6 months ago weren't doing digital, they were doing face-to-face classroom training, as many businesses still are because they haven't made that jump yet. All of a sudden, that's not an option. The vast majority seem to just be jumping straight onto the nearest video conferencing software they have. What are you looking to see that's not that? What could they be doing that they're not?
Yeah, I think there's something very interesting here. So we've been doing this, like peer review is a very social collaborative learning experience. We never did videos and quizzes. In EduFlow, you can set up videos and stuff like that, but we're really focusing on these other things, like the stuff that goes beyond videos and quizzes, discussions, peer review, different kinds of group work and so on. And we've interacted and worked with companies for a few years now that are actually on the forefront of this and doing things interestingly here. One of them, one of our biggest customers, is one of the very largest companies in the world doing stuff you use every day in Silicon Valley. I can't say their name yet, but you use them every day. And they have been doing online training using our products for a while because they have many employees and they can do two things. They can either give them videos and quizzes, which nobody learns from. People just skip the videos and try to hack the quizzes so they can get on with their lives. Or they can put them all in meeting rooms, tens of thousands of people. And that's very costly and very complicated right now. So what do? Like, you try to build some learning experiences online that are more involving, more engaging, and more interactive. And as the thing you just said was kind of interesting, right? Because people feel that the easy solution today is to just video record what they were doing and make video material to put online. That's actually very hard. It's very hard to make good video material. But setting up it's just time consuming, it's resource intensive. But setting up a peer review session, for example, it doesn't take a lot of time. You can spend 30 minutes. You can set up a course on EduFlow, plug in some rubrics and things they have to do. And then your learners or employees or whoever they are can spend hours going through that process, writing and reading and talking. So to build these collaborative learning experiences, you actually offload a lot of work onto the learners and off yourself. Whereas I would say creating high quality video production is very resource intensive on the instructor, and nobody actually watches it. It's very hard to make it very good. And I think that's where something interesting is going on, right? That you want the learners to spend the time. You don't want to have the instructor spend all the time on producing this stuff. You learn by doing, you learn by reading, you learn by assessing, you learn by interacting with the learning material, not by just sitting in a couch and being on your phone while you're supposed to be watching a video.
Absolutely. I think it goes back to those passive versus active experiences, something that, as an instructional designer or a learning experience designer, as we seem to have 30 names for every job role, we forget the basics often, and have done for quite some time, I think. And that simple thing of, I love the fact that you said about doing good video is very difficult. I always think that when you want to do video, your competition is no longer other courses. Your competition is Netflix. Your competition is the person's favorite YouTuber. I can guarantee you your video about data protection regulations are not as interesting as anything on Netflix.
No, then I would watch it because I really need to learn. Everybody needs to learn more about that, right? And I think it's probably going to be more likely that I watch a new series on Netflix.
Absolutely, because there's stuff I'm looking forward to being released over the next year. None of it relates to data protection. It's not on my calendar. But the opportunity to talk, as you say, take discussion points, complete activities, discuss my own findings and research, that at least asks me to do something, to exercise some brain power, rather than just sit and listen and absorb.
I just read, I'm doing a reading spree right now of reading instructional design literature.
Yes.
And I just finished 5 different books, like some of the most recommended books about building great online learning experiences. None of those books say produce really good videos. It's hundreds of pages per book about facilitating online discussions, facilitating peer review, getting students to be creators of things, building good community. And then you go and take any online course today, almost on any of the big MOOC platforms. And what is it? Videos and quizzes, videos and quizzes, videos and quizzes. And then when you're sitting there as a corporate learning designer, for example, and you haven't read all those books necessarily, people expect you to produce these video courses, and nobody questions it. And I think it's become this easy way out to just make video. Actually, right now, there seems to be a new tendency that I'm very much against, but there's this new tendency to be more synchronous and live. And maybe Zoom is doing this to us. But I'm seeing more and more courses now that stops being async and say, like, join our call at whatever 10 a.m. PST to learn about something. Yeah. And it's a horrible time for me. It's right in my dinner time here in Denmark. Why do we need people to sit at specific times in front of their computer on Zoom calls to hear a video? It seems completely backwards.
This is it. If there was ever a benefit of video, you've just removed it, right?
Yeah.
That's and it's interesting because I spoke to a prospective client a couple of weeks ago who I ended up not working with, purely because of this, that they wanted to create a course that would be delivered face to face but over Zoom. 6 hours on a Zoom call.
In one
Um,
go? Please
oh
say no.
oh yes.
What?
It's really surprising that and again, I shan't say who it was, but the company in question is an education company. So they know better. And I think that's kind of true across the industry. I kind of wince when I think across my career how often I've heard the words, "We know it's not the right thing to do, but," and then we proceed to do exactly the wrong thing.
Yeah, I think we've all been doing that a few times, right? I've given 100 lectures by now on peer review, and one of my slides in my lecture is like, you don't learn from listening, and there I am lecturing on them, right? And it's not necessarily very smart of me to have that slide, but they all laugh at it at least, so it's
This is it.
it's okay.
And I think part of that is, our willingness to sometimes, arrow in and go, yep, I'm breaking my own rule here. That's I think that carries a lot of weight, because then hopefully we don't do it the next day and the day after and the day after, and they see the difference thereafter. But I think what you've said around that is something we all need to be thinking about, especially at the moment where certainly in the UK, I know the vast majority of the workforce is at home. Higher education is at home. What we mustn't do is allow 6-hour Zoom calls to become the face of EdTech and digital training in this scenario. The flip side of it is it's a huge opportunity, right? For platforms, like Eduflow, for instructional designers, for instructors and developers to show what we can do to give real value.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's like so many people out there trying to do the right thing, but we're just kind of stuck in this wheel of videos or whatever it is, right? I'm participating somewhat actively in some online communities for instructional designers to learn from them and to kind of share some of my own thoughts. And one of the things that surprised me by interacting with these people who their whole profession is developing learning content is that they keep talking about these products, articulate storyline, these like online digital products for building learning experiences that are essentially slideshows.
Yep.
With quizzes on them. And of all people, they should know better. They should know that you don't create great learning experiences by making slideshows with quizzes on them. That can be part of it, but it surely isn't the whole thing. The problem is that's often what the customer wants. They expect some kind of slideshow with quiz on it, and then they can say that their employees now know basic lab training or whatever. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I think you said exactly the thing there, is all of this, whether it's video, whether it's your favorite authoring tool, whether it's Storyline, Captivate, wherever it might be, these things absolutely have a place in the learning process, but neither of them on their own, and not just the two of them.
Yeah.
I think that the stuff you're talking around, peer review, discussion, I'm a massive fan, when you are doing something purely digital, of giving people tasks and challenges to take back to the real world, because that's where they're actually going to be doing the thing you're trying to get them to do. I think simulation, especially with the kind of advent and expansion of things like VR and AR, is becoming, people are very excited about it, and they're right, it's all very cool technology-wise. Is it necessarily an effective learning experience? I don't
That's
think
a good question.
So. Not yet.
I read a popular article that referenced a paper that I, to be honest, didn't read. But it was about, there's this technology called Labster, which is this, it's actually a Danish EdTech company doing virtual laboratories in virtual reality. Wow. And really good company, doing pretty well right now because all the labs are closed in all universities. And they have a product that started off being not virtual reality, and then they built a VR component on top of it. And then they did a test where they tested the VR version versus the normal version. And the researchers, there was like a third-party research group, found that the people who did the normal version said it was less fun. Like the VR version was much more engaging and fun, but they actually did as well or even better on the exam. and maybe that's just because the exam is not in virtual reality, but maybe it's also because students are really bad at judging good learning. There's a lot of research on this, that students like things that are fun, but learning is not always fun. And I think that's where VR sometimes can have this kind of weird effect that people think it's awesome, even though it doesn't have any effects.
That's really interesting to hear, because I've had an ongoing, since I got into the learning and development community. I started my L&D career as a face-to-face facilitator in the corporate world, and from day one I was introduced to the idea of measuring your effectiveness by sending out happy sheets, basically asking people if they enjoyed their training and was the trainer personable and engaging, and another host of completely irrelevant questions, none of which were, what did you learn? How will you use it in your job? Which are the only things that matter.
It's very hard to assess learning in an honest way, I think.
Absolutely.
We've tried to figure it out with our peer review products, right? That one of the things we've done is that if you do a peer review session in PeerGrid or EduFlow, I give you feedback, for example, and then you give feedback on my feedback. And this is kind of interesting, right? So it gives you a way to say, like, I don't like your feedback, or I like your feedback in this way. And that allows me to become a better feedback giver. It forces you to reflect on my feedback and so on. One of the things it kind of does, but not very good, is it doesn't really give a good estimate of how good the feedback is, because people love being told that their work is great. So when we analyze millions of these feedback reviews, we can see some trends. And one of the trends is that if the feedback is very positive, people like the feedback. There's also some actual data in there, right? You can see that people like feedback that refers to specific things like figures or tables or whatever. Yeah. So you can find evidence of good feedback quality in there, but there's this overarching bias of, ooh, you said my work is good, I really like that. So now we're trying this new experiment that I want to get the data for it before I actually run the analysis, but I would like to see students produce some work, get some feedback on it, produce a better version of the work, and get an evaluation of the version 2. Because then what I can do is I can say what feedback actually made people improve their work in a good way. So that's kind of my personal attempt at trying to evaluate something honestly, but it's very complicated.
Absolutely. I think the acknowledgement of that is the thing that maybe the industry is scared of doing.
Yeah.
I think we end up with happy sheets because no one wants to admit that genuinely saying we have measured this learning is incredibly difficult. Certainly, every project I've been on, we've had key metrics, deliverables, things like that, but to actually measure learning, there is no foolproof way as of yet.
Yeah.
That I've seen anyway, or found, or been able to implement. But I think the willingness to admit that and then try things to find a way, or at least try and move closer to it, is surely what we should all be doing. Whether we're in the tech side of things or in the delivery or design, working in reality would be a fantastic start, rather than pretending that, well, the trainer was really personable and I really enjoyed the experience, is a good measure. I always jokingly said I actually don't care if everyone in the room hated me by the end of the day. What matters is whether or not they can go and give good service or complete whatever it was we were training them to do that day.
Yeah, there's this all this research by this famous guy John Hattie, who did all this research on like visible learning and feedback and so on, and he has this big list of interventions you can do or effects that have an effect on learning. And he has this important point in there that is, almost anything you do will have an effect on learning. So a lot of things will be effective, but not as effective as others. And it's not good enough to just do anything. Like his point is basically that any intervention will make people learn more, but some are more effective than others. So even an intervention that helps people, it might be a waste of time because that time could have been spent on an even better intervention. And I think that's an interesting point, that almost anything you could do, if you study any course, you do something, you will see that people who had the intervention got a better grade at the end. But that's not enough, because it doesn't matter what you do. Almost anything will help.
Absolutely, and I think we see that in our kind of school systems. People do learn in the current school system. Is it particularly efficient and effective as a learning tool? No, not at all. It leaves lots of people behind, but everyone learns something. Um, and it kind of perfectly exemplifies that. And then when you look at the the corporate world, and I'm sure the higher education as well, we see a kind of similar approach of, well, this is how we've always done it, so this is how we'll continue to do it. People do pass, people do fail, people do get promoted, people do get fired, but we're just willing to accept that because it's the norm.
And I think in many cases, the reality is just that things move and maybe often faster than the instructional designer. So before the course is done and implemented and evaluated, priorities have changed. The slogan for the company is now something else, and we should talk about artificial intelligence. And then the course is left behind. They say, well, were people happy? Then it's okay. Then let's make a new course now. It's a new idea. And that's like, sometimes everybody else claims us, like me, the universities, for being slow moving. That's also their advantage sometimes, that they take the time it takes. They run a course for 6 months, then they have 6 months to think about how that went, and then they run it again and again and again. And some of my old professors taught the same course for 25 years, right? And those courses become really good because they get feedback, and they teach. Yeah, it's been taught so many times, and the content doesn't have to change, but the way they teach it can change slowly. That doesn't happen in corporate world, right? It's like, boom, new AI, cool video production, then we kill it, the whole thing, and start something new.
Absolutely. There's never that little bit of reflection on what went well, what's not hitting the mark, how do we make everything's a sweeping change as opposed to that incremental improvement. But I think we're starting to see that in I'm talking about the businesses that really get it. I think everyone knows there's those businesses that are willing to say, we're going to do things differently. And if anything you see about the kind of cultural and education stuff that Netflix did within its business, they really embraced the idea that you can't just swing from one fad to the next when it comes to people's learning. It's about really thinking about every change you make being as impactful as possible, rather than making 50 changes and hoping something sticks.
Yeah.
That's but you did touch on something there that I know a ridiculously small amount about, because it's so far out of my field of expertise I don't even try, to be honest. But AI in the world of learning, every conference I go to now, it's going to revolutionize everything. Instructional designers aren't going to be here in 10 years' time because AI is going to do our job for us. Every tool has got AI branded on it somewhere. No clear explanation of what that AI is doing, but it's there, it's in the branding. And I don't know if it's something that you have involved in in your product and in the worlds that you work
in. I have many thoughts about this. This is my pet peeve, my core expertise, right? So I ended up actually finishing my PhD on AI. So I know a lot about AI. I don't use it much in practice these days because I realized that, as you say, it's slapped on every landing page on every product. And to be honest, it almost never makes any sense for any product to have AI today. It's all words and hype. There's a few products that use some kind of AI or machine learning in a productive way. But things are changing, and they're changing fast. So for people who are following online right now, there's been a massive new release of an AI model called GPT-3 by this consortium called OpenAI. And I've always known and believed that artificial intelligence is coming, and it's going to change the whole world dramatically. Nobody understands just how crazy it will be, and nobody seems to care on the street. It will come. It's not gone come yet, and today most people don't do anything cool with AI. They just talk about it. But I think with the things we've seen in the last couple of weeks, things are taking a bit faster acceleration than most people anticipated. So for the people who don't know a lot about this GPT-3 model is an AI model of some sort that can take text and then it can continue writing on the text. So you could give it a prompt for an essay and it can produce an essay. You can give it a question about something and it will answer the question. You can tell it to make a quiz, it'll make a quiz, or it will generate computer code for you. And we've had this idea for a long time, but it's never been very good. But this one is very good. It's surprisingly good, and people are getting a bit surprised by how good it is. I think what this will in practice mean, we don't really know, but at least you can expect that in 2 years' time, it can write college essays as good as college students can. That poses a challenge for college education. What are you going to do now? I read a few essays produced by it, and honestly, I couldn't spot that it was AI generated.
Wow.
It's extremely good, and it will change everything, I think, in terms of how we think about assessing people. Do we even need to write essays if it can be produced automatically? Yeah, probably. It's a good way to think, but that changes. It can generate courses for you. It can generate quizzes. It can answer the quizzes. I don't know what will happen, but I think AI has been this kind of, it's cool to talk about. It's good to sell your products, but it's not very useful in practice. But now that's changing very fast, I think.
That's really exciting to hear. My dream of a home AI may not be that far off after all. That would be,
No, and it's funny, right? Because still I have a Google Home at home, right? And it still doesn't know anything, right? Half the time it won't turn the lights on and so on. So on one hand, it's so close, and on the other hand, it's like so far. But it's suddenly converging without us realizing it, I think.
Well, that's interesting too. At least it's not just me that feels that the current product spec is perhaps a little overhyped. When I don't know anything about something, I'm always hesitant to say, you're talking rubbish here, but I've got it from an expert now. I can go forth and tell everyone.
Just trust me, I know everything.
That's how it all works, right? But no, it's interesting because you're right. I think a lot of people, certainly in our industry, won't be aware of those massive jumps being made, and that is a little bit terrifying. If they can write courses very well, we might not have jobs much longer. But I'm sure we'll all find something to do.
It's interesting, right? Because I've had this discussion with investors for many years that have or have not invested in our company, and many of them are like this very visionary type that say, okay, so you build peer grade, you get all this data, all this feedback, and then maybe in 10 years you can build an AI that generates the feedback. That would be so cool. And I say, yeah, it would be really cool, but you do realize that the students learn by writing the feedback. Yeah. So if we do this, the students would stop learning. Yeah, okay, but you could build an AI, that'd be really cool. So I think even if the AI can write the essays or write the courses or take the courses, I guess that's the other question, right? Is the idea still to make students smarter, or do we not care about it then anymore? But if we still want to teach people something, we still need them to do the thinking. And it doesn't matter if the AI can write their essay. That doesn't help them much.
No, well, we'll need some kind of information when the machines rise up, no doubt. So we probably shouldn't stop completely.
I don't know. It could be nice to just retire and have an AI do all the work for us uncomplainingly.
So you've assumed they're going to be on our side there.
That's why I'm helping build them. I'm helping build them and train them because I want to be on their side when they take over. I'm not out to kill them. Like, AI, please let me be.
See, they'll keep people like you around.
I hope so.
Brilliant. Well, I think we've covered some really, really interesting topics there. Certainly gone in, brought up some points that I didn't expect to really talk about, especially the depth from the AI one and those jumps forward sound incredible, and like they are going to have really big impacts on the industry in the relatively near future, really. I guess really I'd just invite you, any kind of closing thoughts on EdTech and where we're heading, or where we've been, or what we should or shouldn't be doing right now?
It's a good question. I think my experience of reading that 25 years of EdTech book was interesting, right? That we seem to be going in cycles, and maybe we're just in the middle of another cycle. I think my invitation to the listeners would be to think about other ways to do online learning. Try to think about ways where people can sit in front of their computers at home and not just consume, but actually create and get to know each other, work in groups, all those things you liked from university if you went there, right? it was not necessarily sitting at 8 a.m. listening to a lecture. It was chit-chatting to the neighbor. It was solving problems together. It was the study group you're part of. And if we want to make online learning really great, we have to facilitate those things somehow. And you can use our tool or you can use one of the 1,000 others out there, but it requires that you invest a little bit of time in figuring out what you want to do. And then it's actually not that complicated and time consuming to produce those learning experiences.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ideas Podcast. If you'd like to continue the conversation with me or David, our details will be in the description of today's episode. Remember, this podcast is all about sharing ideas from across the industry. Everyone's welcome, so come and get involved. You can find my contact details and details of the show's Discord server in the description of the episode so you can get involved.